In the hills above the Pacific, the terraces remain perfectly aligned. The colonnades still cast their deliberate shadows. Visitors walk through marble halls assembled from fragments of Europe, guided by discreet ropes and rehearsed narratives. What stands today appears permanent, almost inevitable. But the permanence is an illusion. The estate was not born from stability. It was forced into existence, stone by stone, beam by beam, on a remote California hillside, long before modern machinery made such ambition routine. What now feels like a monument to taste was, in truth, a prolonged act of exertion. Thousands of tons of materials were hauled upward without the convenience of today's cranes, concrete pumps, or digital surveying. Roads had to be carved before walls could rise. Water had to be engineered before fountains could perform. Labor moved slowly. Decisions were handwritten. Everything resisted. The castle endures. The system that built it does not. What matters is not simply how it was constructed, but what its construction required. Money applied without visible limit, logistics sustained by hierarchy, and an owner who believed difficulty itself was proof of legitimacy. The building is intact. The conditions that allowed it to exist are gone. And so the question is not only how it was built without modern machinery, it is what kind of world made such building possible at all.
Chapter 1. The Hill in Silence. In the early morning, before the first tour buses begin their ascent, the hill is nearly soundless. The wind moves across the terraces. The Pacific remains distant but visible, a flat and indifferent horizon. The towers and colonnades of Hearst Castle hold their position above the ranch lands, unchanged in outline, meticulously maintained in surface. The structure appears complete. It is not alive. Paths are swept, balustrades are inspected. Climate systems regulate the interiors to preserve imported ceilings and tapestries. The pools are cleaned to an exacting standard, their water engineered to reflect sky and stone in careful proportion. Every element is stabilized against erosion, environmental, chemical, structural. Preservation has replaced momentum. Once, this hill operated as a private altitude. Access was selective and controlled. Arrival itself signified acceptance into a closed hierarchy. The road upward was not merely logistical, it was ceremonial. Now the ascent is scheduled. Tickets are scanned. Groups are counted. Authority has shifted from invitation to administration. The estate functions with precision, but the precision is custodial. Staff members follow established routes, reciting curated histories in measured cadence. Furniture remains in place not because it is used, but because it has been cataloged. Doors open on hinges that no longer anticipate a household's rhythms. They respond instead to timed rotations of visitors. What stands here today is an arrangement of surfaces stabilized against change. The estate's materials, limestone, marble, carved wood, bronze, were assembled to project durability. They continue to do so. Yet durability without agency produces a different kind of stillness. The building no longer exerts will. It receives observation. The hill itself feels wider now. Without the pressure of private ownership, the grounds have been reorganized into zones of compliance and safety. Railings have been added where once there were none. Pathways are defined by necessity rather than discretion. The informal edges of authority have been formalized into policy. This transformation is not violent. it is procedural. The estate has entered a second life in which it must justify its existence not through dominance, but through interpretation. Plaques explain architectural influences, brochures outline construction phases. The narrative has become externalized. Meaning is delivered rather than implied. The silence that surrounds the buildings each morning is not the silence of anticipation. It is the silence of conclusion. There is no unfinished wing waiting for direction, no new shipment of stone being negotiated, no architect revising elevations late into the night. The hill does not expect alteration. Its current state is treated as final. Yet the stillness contains traces of another tempo. Terraces step upward with deliberate confidence. The Casa Grande's facade remains oriented toward spectacle. The estate's scale exceeds the needs of preservation. It was conceived for expansion, for adjustment, for ongoing assertion. Now it is governed by containment. The rupture is subtle but complete. A private dominion has become managed heritage. Control remains, but its purpose has inverted. What was once organized to project authority is now organized to prevent loss. The estate persists, but the system that animated it has withdrawn, leaving architecture without appetite.
Chapter 2. Why it mattered. Long before it became an artifact of preservation, the hill functioned as a declaration. In a nation still uneasy with inherited power, the presence of Hearst Castle introduced a different proposition: that American wealth, if sufficiently concentrated, could construct its own lineage. The estate did not rely on ancestral centuries. It relied on scale, endurance, and spectacle. Its authority was architectural. The United States had industrial magnates, financiers, and railroad dynasties. What it lacked was visible continuity, stone expressions of permanence that suggested time had already ratified power. On the East Coast, established families leaned on proximity to Europe for cultural legitimacy. The West Coast, newer and more fluid, required another strategy. The hill supplied it. Positioned above ranchland and ocean, distant from urban scrutiny, the estate redefined isolation as elevation. Geography was not incidental. It implied self-sufficiency. The house did not integrate into a city grid or neighbor an established capital. It stood apart, implying that its authority derived from ownership of land, media influence, and disciplined expenditure rather than from civic inheritance. Its towers and courtyards referenced Europe without replicating it. Imported ceilings, cloisters, and facades were not imitations, they were acquisitions. The estate absorbed fragments of older civilizations and rearranged them into a new American synthesis. Culture became transferable, purchasable, installable. This act mattered in a country where aristocracy had been formally rejected but informally desired. The estate offered a controlled version of nobility, one constructed through newspapers, circulation numbers, and political leverage rather than titles. It signaled that media power could evolve into spatial authority. Words printed on newsprint translated into stone set on a hillside. The building's scale exceeded domestic necessity. Bedrooms multiplied beyond household requirement. Guest cottages formed a village. Pools were designed less for recreation than for reflection, literal and symbolic. The estate was calibrated to host not only individuals, but networks. Politicians, actors, industrialists, and editors could be gathered within a controlled environment where hierarchy was subtle but unmistakable. The estate did not merely house influence, it arranged it. Every arrival reinforced an internal order. The climb upwards separated the invited from the public below. The architecture directed movement through cloisters and salons, creating intervals of visibility and privacy. Social choreography unfolded within walls that suggested inevitability. In this way, the Hill contributed to the shaping of American elite identity. It proposed that permanence could be engineered, that heritage could be assembled, that a new aristocracy, unofficial yet disciplined, could emerge not from bloodlines but from sustained economic command. The importance of the estate lay in this assertion. It was less a home than a thesis in stone, that the West, often perceived as provisional and speculative, could generate institutions of endurance equal to any in the older world. Such a claim required more than comfort. It required visibility, repetition, and confidence. The estate delivered all three, establishing itself not simply as a residence, but as a cultural instrument.
Chapter 4. Engineering a Remote Empire. Before facades rose against the sky, the hill had to be persuaded to cooperate. The site chosen for what would become Hearst Castle was not prepared for construction at scale. It was wind-exposed, uneven, and distant from urban supply networks. The nearest rail connection terminated miles away. There were no established service roads capable of carrying sustained heavy loads. Water existed on the ranch, but not in the quantities or elevations required for fountains, pools, and residential use at the summit. The first act of building was therefore subtraction. Hillsides were graded by crews working with steam shovels where possible, but more often with hand tools, horse-drawn equipment, and controlled blasting. Earth was cut and redistributed to create stable platforms. Retaining walls were introduced to prevent seasonal erosion. Surveyors mapped elevations repeatedly, translating irregular terrain into measured increments. Road construction followed necessity rather than elegance. Switchbacks were carved into slopes to allow wagons and early motorized trucks to ascend with stone, timber, and steel. These roads did not serve visitors, they served weight. Every curve accounted for traction and braking on inclines that resisted negotiation. Materials arrived in stages. Stone quarried elsewhere in California was transported by rail to a coastal depot, then transferred onto trucks for the inland journey. Imported architectural fragments, ceilings, portals, columns, crossed oceans by ship before entering the same inland sequence. Each transfer required coordination across time zones and transport systems that operated without digital tracking or centralized scheduling. Delays were expected, weather interrupted shipments, mechanical failures halted convoys, replacement parts required ordering by letter or telegram. Time expanded around logistics. The estate learned patience as a structural condition. At the summit, temporary yards were established to receive materials. Stone was sorted and cataloged, lumber was stacked and seasoned, iron components were inventoried. The hill began to resemble a staging ground more than a residence. Water posed a separate challenge. Springs on the ranch could not supply sufficient pressure to the heights envisioned for pools and guest houses. Engineers designed a network of pipelines and pumping stations that lifted water upward in calculated intervals. Storage tanks were concealed within the landscape, stabilizing supply against fluctuation. Without these concealed systems, ornament would have remained ornamental in name only. Electricity required extension from regional grids. Lines were run across distances that demanded both negotiation and capital. Power on the hill had to be reliable enough to sustain lighting, workshops, and mechanical equipment. Infrastructure preceded ambiance. Labor operated within a defined hierarchy. Foremen coordinated crews of masons, carpenters, metalworkers, and general laborers. Communication moved through paper drawings and verbal instruction. Adjustments were made in situ, with architects and supervisors on site for extended periods. Without modern cranes capable of lifting large stone blocks into position with precision, alternatives were devised. Derrick cranes powered by steam or gasoline were erected temporarily and repositioned as construction advanced. Pulleys and block and tackle systems multiplied human effort. Mule teams hauled loads across distances that would later be traversed by mechanized vehicles. Progress was measured not in weeks, but in seasons. Foundations cured, walls settled, materials acclimated to coastal air. The estate's growth followed a tempo dictated by gravity and friction. The hill was not conquered quickly. It was negotiated, adjusted, and disciplined into compliance.
Chapter 5. Systems of Labor and Control. As the hill stabilized under roads and foundations, a different structure took form, less visible, yet equally decisive. The estate began to organize people. Construction at Hearst Castle did not unfold as a singular campaign with a fixed end date. It operated as an ongoing enterprise, sustained by a workforce that expanded and contracted according to season, shipment, and instruction. The project developed its own internal economy, with rhythms distinct from the towns beyond the ranch gates. At the summit and along the graded slopes, masons cut and set stone with deliberate precision. Carpenters framed interiors that would later be concealed beneath imported ceilings. Metalworkers shaped railings and hardware to align with historical references specified in correspondence. Engineers monitored structural loads, adapting calculations to accommodate additions that had not existed in earlier drawings. These specialists were not interchangeable. Each trade required experience, and the remote location limited the available pool. Skilled laborers were recruited from across California, and in some cases from farther afield. Temporary housing was arranged on the ranch to retain them. The estate began to resemble a small industrial colony, purpose-built, disciplined, and dependent on a single patron. Below this skilled tier operated a broader base of general laborers. They hauled materials, mixed concrete, cleared debris, and maintained access roads. Their work was repetitive and physical, shaped by gradient and weather. The hill demanded endurance. Wind altered scaffolding, fog delayed drying times, heat hardened surfaces prematurely. Every environmental condition translated into adjustment of schedule. Oversight functioned through layered supervision. Foremen reported to site managers. Site managers corresponded with the architectural office. Decisions traveled upward and downward in a controlled chain. Drawings were annotated, revised, and returned. Instructions were transmitted in measured language. The absence of instant communication required anticipation. Mistakes could not be corrected immediately. Money, however, remained immediate. Unlike speculative developments dependent on sales or loans, the estate drew upon a reservoir of media-generated wealth. Payments were issued consistently. Suppliers were compensated without prolonged negotiation. This steady flow insulated the project from many of the financial interruptions that stalled other large constructions. When additional stone was required, it was ordered. When a facade demanded alteration, labor was reassigned. This insulation altered behavior. Craftsmen could refine details beyond minimal necessity. Walls were adjusted for proportion rather than speed.
Imported elements were resited until alignment satisfied aesthetic intention. The estate absorbed revisions without visible strain. Construction became iterative by design. There was no final blueprint locked in permanence. Rooms were expanded after initial completion. Guest houses multiplied. Decorative schemes were replaced before occupancy. The estate did not move toward conclusion, it accumulated. Parallel to the construction workforce, a domestic infrastructure began to assemble. Even before the principal residence reached full capacity, cooks, housekeepers, gardeners, and groundskeepers were engaged. They maintained completed sections while new areas rose nearby. The estate thus functioned simultaneously as building site and household. Control extended beyond wages and tasks. The ranch setting limited casual departure. Social life revolved around the project. Schedules were set by production needs rather than by external markets. The estate dictated tempo. In this environment, ownership translated into system. The hell was no longer terrain under transformation. It had become an organism sustained by coordinated labor, disciplined expenditure, and continuous oversight.
Chapter 6. The Peak of Power. At its height, the hill no longer felt provisional. It operated with the assurance of a completed order. By the late 1920s and into the early 1930s, Hearst Castle had assumed the character of a functioning court, informal in title, exacting in practice. Construction continued in measured increments, yet the estate had already acquired sufficient scale to sustain ritual. The Casa Grande presided over the terraces with deliberate authority. Guest houses formed a contained village below. Gardens were clipped to geometric discipline. The pools held their mirrored surfaces without interruption. Arrival was structured. Invitations were extended selectively, often weeks in advance. Guests traveled by rail or motor car, crossing distances that reinforced anticipation. The final ascent up the ranch roads was controlled and supervised. Entry onto the hill marked a transition from public prominence to private alignment. Inside, movement followed architecture. Long refectories arranged diners along parallel lines, encouraging observation as much as conversation. Ceilings imported from European estates hung overhead, asserting historical continuity within newly poured concrete walls. Tapestries absorbed sound. Fireplaces scaled to monastic proportion anchored rooms designed not for intimacy, but for collective presence. The estate did not display wealth impulsively. It curated it. Objects were positioned to suggest lineage rather than purchase. Sculptures framed corridors. Choir stalls lined media rooms where films were screened for selected audiences. Bookshelves rose to measured heights, signaling literacy as companion to power. Daily life operated on a disciplined schedule. Breakfasts were served at designated hours. Riding parties and excursions were arranged with quiet efficiency. Evenings concluded with screenings in a private theater where Hollywood premieres could unfold before limited audiences. The boundary between industry and residence dissolved. Cinema, journalism, and politics entered the same architectural frame. At the center of this system stood ownership, expressed not through overt display, but through orchestration. William Randolph Hearst did not require formal titles within these walls. His authority manifested through placement: who dined where, who stayed in which guest house, who lingered longer in conversation. Influence moved laterally across the table, but it originated vertically from the hill's summit. The estate's scale allowed multiple worlds to coexist. Film actors mingled with senators.
Editors shared space with industrialists, yet the environment prevented full informality. The architecture imposed a tone. High ceilings moderated voices, stone floors amplified footsteps. Movement felt observed even when unseen. Servants circulated discreetly, maintaining temperature, lighting, and service with minimal intrusion. Kitchens operated with industrial precision to feed dozens without delay. Laundry facilities processed linens at a pace calibrated to occupancy. Gardens were replanted seasonally to ensure continuity of impression. The hill functioned as an integrated organism, social, mechanical, aesthetic. Beyond the terraces, the Pacific remained constant, an expansive backdrop reinforcing isolation. From the summit, the outside world appeared distant, reduced to coastline and horizon. Newspapers printed in distant cities carried influence outward, while the estate gathered influence inward. In these years, the hill achieved its intended synthesis. Media power translated into spatial authority, routine transformed into ceremony, acquisition reshaped into apparent inheritance.
Chapter 7. Pressure from Outside. Power on the hill depended on continuity of revenue, of influence, of public confidence. When those currents began to shift, the change did not arrive as spectacle. It entered quietly through balance sheets and headlines. By the early 1930s, the national economy had contracted with unprecedented force. Advertising revenue, the financial engine behind vast newspaper empires, weakened under strain. Circulation alone could not compensate for the loss of commercial underwriting. Credit tightened. Banks that had once extended favorable terms reconsidered exposure. The estate at Hearst Castle continued to operate, but its insulation thinned. Construction invoices accumulated. Imported architectural fragments still required payment. Skilled labor demanded wages unaffected by national mood. The estate's scale, once an asset of display, now represented ongoing liability. Stone walls did not generate revenue, they absorbed it. Simultaneously, public attitudes toward excess shifted. In earlier years, opulence had signaled ambition and confidence. In a period marked by unemployment and austerity, the same displays invited scrutiny. The hill, visible in photographs and described in print, became part of a broader conversation about concentration of wealth and the responsibilities of ownership. Political pressures compounded financial strain. Regulatory scrutiny of media consolidation intensified. Corporate structures that had allowed rapid expansion were examined with renewed caution. Influence that once moved fluidly through editorial networks encountered resistance from changing administrations and shifting public sentiment. Within this environment, the estate's construction tempo altered. Revisions that had once been approved without hesitation were reconsidered. Additions were postponed. Decorative programs slowed. Shipments already en route were received, but new orders required deliberation. The iterative momentum that had defined earlier decades encountered friction not from terrain, but from liquidity. Correspondence grew more exacting. Budgets were itemized with greater care. Architects and managers were asked to estimate not only aesthetic impact, but cost sustainability. The language of expansion gave way to the language of preservation. Debt entered the structure indirectly. Holdings within the broader media empire were leveraged to sustain operations. When markets contracted further, leverage narrowed flexibility. Assets were evaluated not solely for their symbolic value, but for their capacity to stabilize obligations. The hill felt this recalibration in subtle ways. Fewer workers remained on site during certain seasons.
Completed rooms stayed furnished, yet adjacent spaces paused in partial completion. Scaffolding stood longer than anticipated, not from technical difficulty, but from deferred funding. Social rhythms persisted, but attendance fluctuated. Invitations were extended more selectively. Travel arrangements reflected caution. The estate continued to host, yet the atmosphere adjusted to a more measured tone. None of this signaled immediate collapse. The organism remained intact. Water still circulated through engineered systems. Gardens were maintained. The great rooms retained their authority. But beneath the visible surfaces, the alignment between revenue and expenditure no longer moved without resistance. The hill, once insulated by steady income and confident expansion, now existed within a national climate defined by contraction. Its permanence was tested not by wind or erosion, but by recalculated priorities.
Chapter 8. Hollow Continuation. There was no formal announcement when expansion ended. At Hearst Castle, the change arrived as absence. Fewer shipments reached the hill. Fewer scaffolds were erected against stone walls. The steady percussion of chisels and hammers diminished until it became intermittent, then rare. Construction did not conclude, it receded. Rooms that had been conceived in sketches remained on paper. Decorative programs were simplified or abandoned. Corridors led to spaces designed for future elaboration that never came. The estate retained its magnitude, yet its trajectory altered. Growth ceased to be assumed. The workforce adjusted accordingly. Skilled craftsmen departed in stages, seeking steadier commissions elsewhere. Temporary housing on the ranch emptied. Supervisory structures that had coordinated constant revision contracted to a smaller administrative core. What remained was sufficient to maintain, not to transform. Maintenance replaced invention as the estate's governing discipline. Gardens continued to be trimmed, but without the addition of new terraces. Pools were cleaned, though no further water features were initiated. Stone facades were inspected for weathering, not for extension. The mechanical systems, pumps, generators, heating infrastructure, were monitored with greater attention to longevity than to expansion. Ownership itself shifted in character. Where once expenditure signaled confidence, it now required justification. The estate's costs were measured against competing obligations. Holdings within the broader enterprise were evaluated for liquidity. Decisions that had previously emerged from aesthetic preference were filtered through financial necessity. The hill felt heavier, not physically, but structurally. Its vast surfaces demanded care disproportionate to their utility. Guest houses stood ready, though occupancy fluctuated. Dining halls retained their arrangement, even when fewer voices filled them. The estate had been engineered for density. It now operated in intervals. Extraction entered quietly. Artworks were assessed for potential sale. Collections were inventoried with an eye toward value rather than placement. The estate's contents, once gathered to reinforce architectural authority, became assets capable of conversion. The logic of accumulation inverted. Yet the buildings themselves remained intact. Towers continued to define the skyline. Courtyards held their geometry. From a distance, nothing suggested contraction. The Pacific still framed the western horizon. The approach roads still ascended with ceremonial patience. What had changed was internal tempo. The estate no longer anticipated addition, it awaited stabilization. Budgets were allocated to prevent deterioration rather than to pursue grandeur. Decisions favored durability over distinction. The organism persisted, but its metabolism slowed. Visitors, when present, encountered an environment that appeared complete.
Few could perceive which wings had been intended for further elaboration, which surfaces had been simplified from earlier ambition. The incompletion was conceptual rather than visible. It existed in the absence of forward motion. On the hill, silence acquired a different quality. It was no longer the quiet between phases of construction. It was the quiet of a system adjusting to limits.
Chapter 10. What the Hill Still Holds. The machinery is gone. No mule teams strain against loaded wagons on the switchbacks. No derrick cranes pivot above unfinished walls. No draftsmen wait for instructions delivered by letter. The systems that once drove the ascent of stone and steel have dissolved into archive and memory. What remains on the hill is quieter, but not inert. At Hearst Castle, the architecture endures as a complete argument, even in the absence of its original command structure. Towers still rise against the coastal sky. Terraces step downward with geometric assurance. The pools hold their measured reflections. The estate retains coherence, though the hierarchy that animated it has been dismantled. The ranch land surrounding the summit continues to stretch outward, but it no longer functions as private perimeter. It is managed landscape. Boundaries are administrative rather than personal. The ascent road carries visitors who arrive without invitation, yet follow regulated paths. Access is open but directed. Inside the principal residence, imported ceilings remain suspended above stone walls poured and cured without contemporary machinery. Hand-carved details hold their edges. Ironwork resists corrosion through maintenance rather than replacement. The surfaces bear witness to a construction process that depended less on automation than on coordination and endurance. The estate's persistence is physical proof of an earlier mode of ambition. Before hydraulic cranes and digital surveying instruments simplified vertical scale, elevation required patience. Stone blocks were hoisted through systems of pulleys and counterweights. Concrete was mixed and transported under conditions that demanded calculation without computational aid. Water was lifted to heights through mechanical staging rather than electric immediacy. The hill became habitable because effort accumulated without interruption. What remains visible today is not the labor itself, but its residue. Walls stand in alignment. Foundations hold steady against seismic movement. Infrastructure, concealed within terraces and beneath courtyards, continues to function decades after installation. The absence of visible machinery emphasizes the permanence of what manual and early mechanical methods achieved. The hierarchy that once governed these spaces has dissipated. There is no singular figure orchestrating dinner seating or directing architectural revision. The estate no longer convenes political alliances or premieres films in private sequence. Its rooms are inhabited briefly, then vacated. Authority has thinned into stewardship. Yet the building does not collapse under this thinning. It sustains a different tempo. Visitors walk through refectories designed for extended gatherings and encounter proportion that exceeds their immediate needs. They stand beneath ceilings transported across oceans and sense continuity without fully tracing its origin. The estate communicates scale and intention without reliance on narrative embellishment. What the hill holds, then, is evidence of coordinated labor, of sustained expenditure, of belief in architectural permanence at a time when technological convenience was limited. The structure stands as a record of ambition translated into material discipline. The fortune that financed it has fragmented across generations and markets. The newspapers that underwrote its expansion have altered form. The personal authority that once radiated from its summit no longer directs movement within its walls. The stone, however, persists.